Testing, testing. Sorry, we appear to be having some technical issues here. Not all parties can hear our webinar, so give us just a couple minutes here while we sort through this.
Okay. Yes. Okay, it's working.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry about that.
Yes, works. Okay. Works now, yes, okay.
Okay, bear through us. We're sorting through these comments.
Okay, thanks everyone. We've got it all figured out. So if you can't hear us, then send in something. But if you can hear us, then okay, perfect. So I guess we'll maybe start back and we can give a brief.
Yeah, that's a great idea. We'll kind of start over here.
Sorry, everyone.
Go through everything a little bit. Yeah, I apologize for that. We're technical issues, unfortunately, are sometimes part of a webinar, but we can get. We haven't missed too much here. So again, the class is about asbestos and due diligence real estate transactions. So part of what we're going to cover this morning is a brief history of asbestos use, and then ultimately how that's affected modern products, and ultimately how that's affected regulations, which in turn is going to affect your real estate transactions. So we've covered my information. This is a good slide, so we'll kind of summarize what we've already looked at with this slide. So again, asbestos is a set of 6 naturally occurring silicate minerals that grow in a fibrous aggregate of high tensile strength crystals. They are flexible, long, and thin. These crystals have individual fibers that can be released by abrasion and other processes. So that's a lot of scientific words, all that to basically say that asbestos occurs naturally. It's mined from the earth. And because of that, it actually has a very long history of use, including back in the early 1800s, or the late 1800s, excuse me. First reports of lung disease were actually in appearance, to the point where in 1918, there was a report from the US government that revealed that American and Canadian life insurance companies wouldn't sell coverage to asbestos workers because there was linked evidence between that work and health problems. There was another report in 1924 that first mass circulated worker death in England. And ultimately, this is a part of why asbestos is such a big concern. Asbestos causes asbestosis and has been implicated as causing certain cancers. We're going to briefly go through this. It's all this to say, asbestos has been used a long time. There's mines going back as far as 5000 BC. It was used in anything from candles, lamps, and mummies, and around bodies which were going to be cremated. There's even evidence that that's actually part of London's Natural History Museum of a purse made of fireproof asbestos back from the 1725. There's evidence of paper being made from asbestos. There's evidence from the 1800s of the Italian government using asbestos fibers in banknotes. And because asbestos is such a fire retardant, it was even used in the Partisan Fire Brigade in the mid 1950s. They wore fireproof jackets and helmets, which are made from asbestos. So I think this is about where we are at, so that's great, we're caught up. So asbestos in modern society, again, it's extremely durable and resistant to fire and chemicals. Now, you have a picture here on your slide of an actual fireman in an asbestos suit, and this is actually from the 1960s. So even as far back as the 1960s, or as recent as the 1960s, asbestos was used predominantly even in such applications. Here's another advertisement. This is a little bit older, from 1912, but it's from asbestos roofing. So this will start giving us an idea of age dating and when you need to be concerned with asbestos appearing on houses. But yet again, here's an advertisement specifically for asbestos roofing because it was considered such a valuable material and good at being durable and again as a good fire retardant. Advertisement for asbestos siding, asbestos flex board. You can see from the ad here, the fireproof building sheet, which has helped revolutionize home design. And you can see this house actually looks relatively modern. So again, this was used predominantly, we get a lot of questions about asbestos siding, and hopefully we'll be able to answer a lot of those later in the presentation here. Here's another advertisement from 1903, asbestos baking paper sheets, literally used.
Hold on, now we're getting that the slides aren't, we still see the fire now.
Do that. Okay, do you all see an ad for asbestos roofing?
No. Bear with me just 1 second. Okay. Okay.
Now we have an ad for asbestos flex board, hopefully, that you can see on the slides here.
Yes, okay.
Okay.
Cool. Sorry about that, everyone. I don't
Maybe
know
we
what's
can
going
go.
on.
Let's go quickly to the next slide to make sure. So now we have an ad for asbestos baking paper sheets. Do you all see that? Okay, great. Sorry about that. You haven't missed too much with missing those slides, but again, hopefully since you can hear it, all this to say, asbestos is used a lot in a lot of different things. So let's keep moving forward here. Here's another advertisement from 1937. It shows a picture of a lady who says, "These new asbestos tiles will give my babies a clean and safe place to crawl and play." It's a little bit ironic. It's a little bit sad. Unfortunately, the nice thing with asbestos tiles is they were installed in such a way that they are less likely to break off and be a health concern in that way. But again, asbestos tiles, another area that we see that needs to be abated when it comes up. I think this is the second last advertisement here. Fireproof asbestos money bag. You can take it with you. Again, just showing again the use. Air raid clothes from the 1950s. These air raid suits are made from fireproof cloth. Advertisement for insulation. You have probably seen asbestos insulation. Unfortunately, if you see black insulation around piping, that's literally called asbestos insulation, and it has asbestos 100% of the time, or 99% of the time, I should say. Okay, so here we go. We're starting to get back through the advertisements into the more science before we get into the regulations here. So asbestos fibers, each year we breathe about 1 million fibers from the natural erosion of asbestos-containing rock. It's an average of about 250 fibers per cubic meter of air. It's actually comparable to the typical outdoor mold spore levels. So again, this is something that it's impossible to escape from because it's a naturally occurring element. And the background levels in the United States have peaked in the early 1980s and have been declining ever since. And we'll get to why that's the case. Asbestos levels are also higher in urban areas versus rural areas. That will likely make sense because it's predominantly in building materials. There's going to be more buildings in urban areas than there are in rural areas. So regulated types of asbestos, again, bear with us as we get through the science here. Chrysotile is 95% of total asbestos. This whole slide is designed to not only give you the names of these materials, but also to show that they appear in a number of different colors, and as well as a number of different uses. So chrysotile is white. It's an adhesive, brakes pads, drywall, fireproofing materials, gas insulation, roofing, and vinyl. Amosite is generally brown. It can be in cement sheets and pipe insulation, insulating ceiling tiles and thermal insulation products. Crocodylite is blue. It's used in steam engines, some spray-on coatings. You don't see this as much in residential properties, but it is worth noting. Anthophylite, it's gray, a dull green, or white. That's a much more limited quantities. Tremolite and actinolite, again, less used than the other ones mentioned above it. And here's kind of the important point here with asbestos is DEQ deems any material containing more than 1% of any type of asbestos that would be an asbestos containing material. So if you see ACM, that acronym, in any report, and specifically if you see that ACM contains 1% or more, that is considered asbestos containing. So on lab reports, most of the time, to show it as being non-detect or not a concern, you'll see a less than 1% to show that the asbestos, if there is any, it's less than 1%. So mineral families, we won't get into this too much here as another science thing. There's basically two mineral families. There's serpentine and amphibole. And the serpentine is really the more predominant because that's where the cruciatile is from. And unfortunately, the serpentine is actually worse. You can see that the amphibole has needle-shaped fibers and they're smaller and sharper. So you would think that might be worse in a way. And it is in that they can get into your system further. But the serpentine, they really embed into the lung tissue once it's inhaled. So here's something that will be directly applicable to you all. So now we're going to start getting into the regulations and what will be more applicable in that way. So vermiculite, that's a question we get a lot. What is vermiculite? Why is it a concern? Or is it a concern at all? So vermiculite is a naturally occurring material which is similar to mica. It has similar properties to asbestos, but it itself does not contain asbestos. However, a mine near Libby, Montana, which is the predominant mine in the United States where asbestos was mined, was the source of over 70% of all vermiculite sold in the United States from the period of 1919 to 1990. There was also a deposit of asbestos at that mine. So by virtue of that, the United States Environmental Protection Agency has stated that you should assume that vermiculite insulation is from Libby and treat the material as if it is contained asbestos. And therefore, if you see vermiculite, the way it's regulated it's essentially asbestos. It's treated in the exact same way, and it has to be abated in the same way that asbestos is. There is more information that you can gather online from by searching EPA vermiculite, but that's the kind of long and short about vermiculite. So if you see it, just take it as it is. It's essentially asbestos or considered asbestos-containing material. So asbestos. In some ways, we could have started with this first, but we don't want to be pushing an initiative of fear with asbestos. It's out there. It's used in a lot of materials. But one of the things it's very much worth noting is the reason asbestos was used so predominantly is because it was an exceptional building material. It's extremely durable. Most asbestos materials used today or in homes today are not necessarily at immediate risk. It's only at a risk if you're going to be doing projects in your home where that asbestos is going to be disturbed. If you're going to be doing any renovation work where asbestos is contained, then that needs to be abated before those projects so that it doesn't become airborne. So ultimately, asbestos is not something that's immediately infiltrating your breathing space if you live in a home with asbestos in every situation. In many situations, we would find that asbestos fibers are not at a risk in most residences. Now, that being said, there's a misconception that asbestos-related disease is less of a problem today because there is less asbestos than there was in the 1960s and 70s. However, we're still reaping the consequences of asbestos exposures from up to 50 years ago. And again, these materials were used predominantly in homes. And we'll get to the kind of the history on that, when it was used, when it was stopped being used, as well as the recent regulations that have kind of changed how that's being viewed. So even where asbestos has been banned, workers and the public can be exposed during incorrectly performed removal procedures or in buildings with improperly remodeled asbestos-containing material. Asbestos really becomes hazardous only if the asbestos fibers break off and become airborne. So again, if you're doing a project where the fibers can become airborne through either product use, building maintenance, repair and remodeling, or demolition work. And the last two are really where the current regulations are stemming from. So we'll be covering those greater once we get to that spot on regulations. Asbestos fibers are readily inhaled into the alveoli. And those are the air sacs at the very end of the respiratory system. So the slide, hopefully it can be very readily visible from your presentation or your screen. Those are the smallest branches in your lungs. So as you can see, anything that's inhaled into your lungs, it has large pathways, and then they get smaller and smaller. So when these asbestos fibers are inhaled, they don't just stay in your trachea or even some of the larger branches of your lungs. They get into the smallest areas, and they really can't be removed. And because of that, once they're inhaled, they sit there. They sit there dormant. And over time, our bodies actually develop mechanisms of trying to protect us from those. So they secrete different materials around them, and then ultimately that is what can be formed into cancerous cells and tumors in our lungs. So long-term inhalation of asbestos fibers increases the risk of lung cancer and mesothelioma, which is probably the most common linked condition to asbestos exposure. So health impacts are sometimes seen in the asbestos worker's family, presumably from exposure to asbestos fibers carried home on work from clothes. So again, this isn't something that is readily seen in every single situation, but if someone was working in an asbestos mine, there are linked studies to that. Going back to Libby, Montana, there is actually a number of counts of fatalities and people impacted, even those that didn't work in the mines, because that mining activity was carried home to homes, and just how mining operates, those fibers were becoming airborne in the whole city just over the time of being mined in that city. So another thing that's worth noting is the enlargement of the heart can occur as an indirect effect from the increased resistance of blood flow. So if your lungs aren't operating as efficiently because there's that buildup of asbestos that can affect not only your heart, but really can affect the rest of your body. So again, we don't want to be pushing fear with association with this, but it's definitely worth noting that asbestos is a serious matter. We've done presentations where there have been people in the crowd that say, yeah, I lived in Libby, Montana, or I had a relative that worked in an asbestos mine and they had mesothelioma developed later in life. So these are very well documented things. And that's a big part of why the regulations are what they are. Not to say that the regulations aren't too strict or are not strict enough. They ultimately are what they are. They're established by the federal government. But that's why they have been put in place. It's because there's documented health effect here. So asbestosis, we're not going to cover this at length other than to show a couple slides here. So you can see a little bit better with that slide on the bottom of the slide here. There are different pockets of the lungs that are being affected by the asbestos buildup. So asbestosis is not necessarily cancerous. It's a chronic scarring of the lungs, which is caused by asbestos. So ultimately, this can have long-term issues, breathing complications, and then that can in turn affect us if we have other conditions like asthma, or if we're in an area with other indoor air quality issues. So the lung tissue itself, not the airways, is damaged. So mesothelioma, again, we're not going to cover this at length. It's relatively rare in the general population, which is even more interesting because the cases that we have seen are, there's almost always a direct line to exposure to asbestos. Unfortunately, there's no known cure. As we talked about earlier, those asbestos fibers, they're penetrating deep into our lungs. And unfortunately, because of that, there isn't a known cure. It'd be very difficult to extract all those. The number of cases has been increasing, probably a combination of things, not necessarily because there's more asbestos out there, but because awareness has become higher. And those building materials, they are still out there. That's, again, why there's these regulations in place. The latency period is generally 30 to 40 years, with longer periods seen where there had the lower levels of asbestos exposure, and with the risk increasing exponentially with time after about 10 years. So that's another thing that's worth noting here. Asbestos, like radon, is a long-term exposure issue. So being exposed to asbestos for a day, an hour, is not necessarily immediately life-changing, or is going to cause something like mesothelioma. That being said, there are still regulations in place so that there is no exposure, because there is also no known safe exposure to asbestos. All right, getting into the regulations here. Asbestos is one of the first hazardous air pollutants regulated under the air toxics program because, again, it's been known to be an issue for quite some time. In 1971, EPA first identified asbestos as a hazardous pollutant. In 1973, EPA developed the asbestos NESHAP, currently found in that regulation 40 SFR Part 61 Subpart M. It is worth noting this has been amended several times, most comprehensively in 1990. In 1995, the rule was amended to correct cross-reference citations to OSHA, DOT, and other EPA rules governing asbestos. So again, we don't want to get too deep into the regulations other than what's most immediately beneficial to you all. It's worth noting that there's no operating asbestos mills in the United States today. However, it is still legal to import asbestos-containing material into the United States. About 870 tons of asbestos were imported into the United States in 2009. So again, this is still something that's being used. We'll get into when it was stopped being used into specific building materials, but again, it is still imported, it's still around, and it's still going to be a process to remove it completely from everywhere that we encounter. As a brief summary of regulations, most lenders agree that buildings built or remodels occurring after 1989 likely do not contain asbestos. Homeowners can legally abate asbestos-containing material in their home while they live in the home. And that's an important thing to note, is there are two parties that can legally abate asbestos: homeowners that are living in the home and contractors that are licensed with Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, or in other states there are other licensing. Those are the only two entities that can abate asbestos material legally. And this is going to become more of an issue, especially as we go through some additional slides with the new regulations. Now, asbestos can usually be maintained in place. As long as it remains in good condition, there are little or no exposure issues. So thankfully, in many cases, it doesn't require having someone with an asbestos inspection license to come out to the property and look to see if all the asbestos is maintained in place, if it's in good condition. Home inspectors, in a lot of cases, they're obviously looking at everything else. They very well might mention this is a potential asbestos-containing material. However, it appears to be in good condition, or okay, this is an asbestos-containing material and it is already fraying. It's a tile that is cracked. They very well will mention those types of things in a home inspection report. So it doesn't require you all as real estate agents to have an asbestos licensed inspector on every single property in every single situation. We're definitely not going to say that, and hopefully that isn't something that becomes standard because of the additional costs that would be associated with something like that. Now, asbestos-containing materials and use. The federal requirements prohibited asbestos from being used in manufacturing in 1978. But there are exceptions, and some of those things, again, are still in place. So asbestos-containing materials and products manufactured prior to 1979 were still sold at a later date. So again, this is why the age and the issue of materials actually ranges far beyond 1979. Manufacturers had 5 years to deplete their stocks, going to 1983, and then distributors had 5 extra years to deplete their stocks. So that's going all the way to 1988. And again, there's always a possibility that someone had a stash of those asbestos materials laying around and install those at a later point. And as we've already covered, it's still legal to import asbestos-containing materials into the United States. So as far as residential ACM goes, common residential sources of asbestos-containing material are attic and wall insulation, vinyl floor tiles and the backing of vinyl sheet flooring and adhesives, The 9x9 and 12x12 tiles are among the most concerning. So if you see 9x9 or 12x12 tiles in a home that is built 1980 or before, definitely possible that those tiles have asbestos. And again, it doesn't mean it's necessarily an immediate concern. It is something to be aware of. Roofing and siding shingles often have asbestos. Asbestos paper, millboard, or cement sheets on walls or floors are sometimes found. Textured paint, especially popcorn ceilings. I'm sure you all have seen that, popcorn ceilings and patching compounds used on walls and ceilings. It is worth noting that the popcorn ceilings don't always have asbestos. So just because you see popcorn ceiling doesn't mean it's automatically asbestos. However, some of these other ones, the floor tiles in particular, and mastics almost always do have asbestos. So there's a lot of questions that will probably come up, not necessarily just during this presentation, but moving forward as you do home inspections, as you look at houses. And you can always call us to ask us a simple question. Is this material likely to contain asbestos? And we can answer that yes or no, often on the phone. Or if you need in-person consultation, that is always available as well. So some continued residential sources, insulation, as I've already noted, insulation that's black, and in many cases we'll even have a label that says asbestos containing insulation. Like I said, about 99% of the time that is asbestos if you see it. Insulation on oil and coal furnaces and door gaskets, obviously this isn't as much concern as we've moved away from those sources in many cases. We do see still on heat resistant fabrics. Automobile clutches and brakes, not as much of a concern for you all. Gaskets, coatings, and packaging, again, not as much of a concern, but you might see them in odd places during an inspection. Actually, I'm going to go back to our picture here. So you can see there really are a lot of different places where asbestos can be found. And because of that, having an asbestos inspection for the whole property is something worth considering. And it will be more valuable as we get to the new regulations on asbestos. You can see virtually in every room in a house, it's possible that you could see asbestos, especially based on the age of the house. You might see it in the roof. You might see it in blown-in insulation in the form of vermiculite. You might see it in bathrooms. You might see it textured or stipple-coated walls and ceilings, artificial fireplaces, logs, and ashes. There could be an asbestos pad under the fireplace hearth. You could see it in the tiles we've already talked about, gypsum board, filling compound, and drywall. There are cases where we do see asbestos in that. We see it in cases in soffit boards and deck under sheeting. And as we just talked about, we see it in other older forms of insulation for boilers and furnaces, specifically with coal and oil. So again, it's something that we can see in a lot of places. This is obviously kind of a worst case scenario house, but it is possible that we'll go into a house with the assumption that there might just be one or two materials, and through the process, we might find that there's many more. Especially one of the things that we see is with older houses is that they've been renovated. So we might find that there's multiple layers of vinyl or multiple layers of tile. And in some cases, it might be worth testing each of those to see if they are containing asbestos. Okay, so here's probably the biggest thing that we're going to get to, and this is definitely relevant for you all, not only for current, but for future, because unfortunately these rules are not going to become less strict. They're going to become more strict, and they already have even beyond 2015. So in 2015, Oregon legislator passed SB 705, directing the Environmental Quality Commission to require that an asbestos survey of a residence be done before a property is demolished. So this has been in place for quite a while, give or take 5 years. And I think for the most part, we haven't seen too many issues with a house being demoed. That being said, there are still contractors out there that have not heard of this rule, that are doing demos, and they may not have done an asbestos survey. There's going to be some additional information about this, but just be aware that that's something, if you're having a house demoed, having an asbestos survey is required in every situation.
So even if a house is, I mean, this might not ever happen, right? But even if a house is, you know, relatively new or newer than 1980s and say, you know, they want the land so they demo the house, an asbestos survey would still be required for that.
Yes, exactly. It would still be required, and in part, we've briefly talked about the impact that asbestos has once it's caused to be airborne. So let's say you didn't have a survey done on a house that may or may not have asbestos. It might have building materials that were never even used or something that was stored in the house, and that's part of why DEQ has required this specifically for Oregon. So, and Bill, and that's a great question. That's a question we get a lot. And there's another rule that we'll be getting to shortly that also is related to that. So buildings constructed after a certain cutoff date from the survey have been established. SB 705 established an effective date for these rules of January 1st, 2016. In order to meet the legislative deadline, DEQ is undertaking parallel temporary and permanent rulemakings. Well, those permanent and temporary rulemakings have been made more permanent, and they will be fully in effect by 2021. The permanent rules are anticipated to replace the temporary ones, and so again, this is all very recent, so that's in part why we're doing this webinar, is these rules are very much new to the scene. As Kayla said at the beginning of the presentation, January 2019, there was brand new rules implemented. So I believe the next couple slides we're going to be getting to that. So according to the DEQ, the affected parties include residential property owners, residential demolition and general contractors, developers, waste disposal franchises, etc. What they don't say is residential property owners, well, you're dealing with that with every single real estate transaction. So this affects you. This affects home inspectors that are working on those properties. Any party really that's working on a house could be affected by these rules. And unfortunately, DEQ has made some efforts to make these things known, but it's still very much a process. DEQ determined the effect of the amended rules at a minimum, the increase equal to the cost of asbestos survey, and at a maximum, an increase equal to the cost of the survey plus cost of properly treating the asbestos-containing materials. So they actually do this. As part of when they put these rules in effect, they develop an idea of what they think it's going to cost people. Unfortunately, with something like this, I don't know that they considered every single situation that it could be costly. So, and there's additional information, Oregon SB 705. So here's the big one. This is the one that was sent out by those in Kayla's office earlier this year. This is the one that is very, very relevant. So the Oregon Association of Realtors put out this notice, I believe it was in March of this year, perhaps even earlier. So there's a couple things that were noted in that notice that we are going to go through here. And these are verbatim of what was put out because I think that they are very well written. So the residential renovation asbestos survey, all houses and other residential buildings constructed prior to 2004 must now have an asbestos survey conducted by an accredited inspector prior to demolition and renovation activities. So not only for demolition, but renovation activities, with the one-man exemption for owner occupants doing their own renovation work. This expands the existing asbestos survey requirement for asbestos demolitions and for commercial demolitions and renovations. So obviously this is going to cause a lot of questions right away. What if you have a plumber over to your house and they need to replace a little bit of drywall because there was a leak of a pipe, or they need to cut something out just to get that area accessed? They need to have an asbestos survey done based on what DEQ is now requiring. It's not to say that DEQ is going to have a police force out to inspect every home built before 2004 to enforce this. Where it really becomes an issue is when you have this material, and maybe from a small situation like that where you're cutting out just a small amount of drywall, maybe you get away with throwing it away, which would be considered illegal if it's not contained properly. But if you have a situation where asbestos material is removed, whether it's not known to be asbestos, if it is found to be asbestos, then they're going to trace it back to two parties. One, the contractor or person that took it out, and to the property owner. Both parties are liable, and the homeowner especially is the most liable for that. So again, that's why this is an immediate concern, because the homeowner is immediately responsible for anything done. Now, historically speaking, what has been done before 2019, in a sense, can be grandfathered in, but it's not to say that DEQ is going to be kind in every situation. They've put these rules in force in part because they consider it a very big deal, and that is shown by the fines that they levy and the consequences they put out in response to that. So again, we don't want to push fear in this situation, but it is very, very much worth noting because this is a immediate concern, obviously, for every transaction. As there's that possibility of containing asbestos, and if you ever have a project in the future, it has to have an asbestos survey. So if you're going to do a kitchen remodeling, that kitchen specifically would just need an asbestos survey. If you're going to do something more major, let's say you're renovating the entire house, well, you really should have the entire property inspected for asbestos by a licensed inspector. So this is not necessarily as immediate of an issue unless you have homeowners that are doing their own asbestos abatement. But there's updated disposal requirements for the non-friable waste, and that's the waste which traditionally has not been considered as much of an issue. But basically, non-friable waste is now considered as bad as friable. Non-friable asbestos waste must now be packaged with the same as friable asbestos waste. So basically, they're no longer looking at asbestos as, oh yeah, some of this is better than others, so we don't need to be as careful with it. They're basically saying all asbestos is equally bad and needs to be handled accordingly. So friable materials, those are materials that are already at risk, that they're already being exposed into the air, are those that can be easily crumbled and release asbestos fibers, while non-friable materials, those that are fine, a piece of tile that's all has no issues, no cracks, no crumbling, they are treated the same way. So applying the same packaging standard for non-friable and friable standards in DEQ's mind, streamlined and packaged requirements for all asbestos waste and ensured safer work environment. So, and we're going to get to a little bit more why this is relevant in the next couple slides here. So, and the last part of the notice from Oregon Association of Realtors, starting January 1st, 2019, the bulk asbestos samples collected during asbestos survey must be analyzed by a lab that participates in a nationally recognized accreditation or testing program. So actually, I believe this is going into effect January 1st, 2021. So there are already standards that require a lab to be accredited. They're basically changing that. So it will probably not affect realtors very much or even the industry very much, other than it's very much worth noting that the lab that you take your asbestos samples to, or if you take them to us, we're going to make sure that the lab that it goes to is registered with DEQ, because DEQ is going to hold us responsible. They're going to hold the homeowner responsible if it was done in a way that maybe wasn't as thorough as they require. So asbestos surveys and inspections. The next few slides, unfortunately, are probably the most important for you all, but I do want to leave a couple minutes for questions towards the end here. So asbestos surveys and inspections, as of January 2019, DEQ released new standards for asbestos surveys, which are more stringent than ever before. They've basically made it very difficult for a homeowner to be involved with this process, even though legally they can. The training process for asbestos surveying companies or inspectors is very long. It's a 3-day process and requires yearly renewal. And basically all commercial buildings, regardless of construction date, and all residential buildings constructed before 2004 must have an asbestos survey conducted by an accredited inspection prior to demolition or renovation activities. So again, this changed the commercial properties, regardless of age, those all have to have an asbestos survey conducted, and then residential, anything constructed before 2004 must have that survey done. And the copy of the asbestos survey must be on site during all renovation or demolition activities. DEQ does do inspections for asbestos related work. So it's just another way of saying this is something DEQ takes very seriously, and they are very much looking around for issues. So it becomes more and more difficult for a homeowner in these types of situations doing their own work. We know homeowners that do it, and some of them maybe have done asbestos abatement in the past, so it's a little bit easier. But it's going to become more and more difficult for a homeowner to do this work themselves, or at least to do it in a way that they do not run the risk of DEQ fines or other types of violations.
So you noted before, Zach, that In 2015, the rule was that homeowners doing their own renovations could essentially not have this, or if they were living in the building, they wouldn't have to have the asbestos survey done. But now it looks like in January, that's changed to regardless of whether the homeowner is living in the dwelling or not, and doing their own work, that now every single thing after any single, repair or renovation on homes constructed after or before 2004, they have to, regardless of whether they're living there or not.
That's correct. So basically, even if a homeowner wants to do their own work, let's say they're doing something minor, let's say they're just doing that kitchen remodel we talked about, they could take a couple samples and have those done. However, those samples would have to be collected in a manner that meets DEQ standards. And because it's an inspection, by definition, it would have to be done according to inspection standards. I haven't listed all those in here, but it includes basically everything you can think about: date, time, condition when the samples were taken, the lab that it was taken to, why the work is being done, other conditions such as if a building material is removed, is there anything behind it that could also be at risk? So the survey is very involved. A homeowner could very well try to do that themselves, but they definitely run the risk of missing something. And again, if they miss something, DEQ can and will hold them liable because they have to have a copy of that asbestos survey. And unfortunately, those are the projects that DEQ is going to be looking for as homeowners that give notice to DEQ that they're going to do an abatement project, because that's another requirement that you have to give DEQ notice. So yeah, I see there's a question here. So we're actually going to get to the cost of the asbestos survey on the next slide here. So that will definitely answer that here. So again, a copy of the asbestos survey must be on site for all renovation and demolition activities and provided to DEQ upon request. Surveys generally include a sample of each type of material. Again, we're going to kind of go through this quickly. This is part of the list of what's required. Basically everything you can imagine about the whole process of testing. All the materials, all the types of potential asbestos types, the locations, color, texture, pattern, location, time of when it's collected, friable, non-friable, as well as an approximate quantity of the material. So again, failure to do any of this, again, not to be fear-based, but just know DEQ does find asbestos issues probably more than just about anything I see on a regular basis. So here we go, here's pricing. Yeah, again, relevant information for you all. So typical pricing structure, $325 for initial site visit and 2 asbestos samples. So again, this isn't for a full property survey. This is basically an initial consultation for alpha, or most companies probably have a similar structure for fees, but to come out and basically take 2 samples. And the alternative to this is that samples can be picked up if they are already collected, as in they are taken by the homeowner and put in a Ziploc bag. Alpha technicians, usually myself for the Salem area, and there's others up in the Portland and coastal areas, but it has to be already collected in a Ziploc bag. So those cases at $75 per sample. But if you're not sure about a couple of different materials, then that's where we can come up to a property and do 2 samples. Now, if you need a full survey done, the base price, and it should definitely be noted, this is a base price, is $975. We've already noted how often asbestos can appear in houses.
So Zach, so say I'm a homeowner and I take my own samples and I drop them off for the $75 per sample analysis, and it comes back that maybe my sample was invalid, or there was an issue with the material that I as a homeowner collected and dropped off to you. What can you do in those situations, or what is the course of action? Do you see that happen a lot, or? Yeah,
that's a great question. We almost never see that happen. I actually can't even think of a case offhand recently. Yeah. Thankfully, with asbestos, you don't need very much material to do an analysis. About the size of a quarter is enough. And in all honesty, labs can probably get away with less. So if you chip off a piece of a quarter of tile or drywall, popcorn ceiling, basically just take a knife and scrape out or cut out a section of that material for analysis, quarter size will do the trick every time. So that, thankfully, yeah, again, that's something that very rarely that I can think of comes up. And that's, again, obviously a good question for people when they call into our office. Hey, I want to know my options. You know, obviously I don't have hundreds of dollars to spend on every single inspection anyway, and this is just one more. I know there's already a lot of costs with purchasing a home. So yeah, the $75 sample collection and analysis drop off, we do quite a few of those, and that's part of the reason why. So the whole residential survey, to conclude my thought there, it's very possible that we'll need more than 10 samples. It's very possible that during the process of doing the survey, we'll find that there's tile on tile, and both tiles will need to be tested. And this isn't something that this is based on us Alpha being as invasive as possible, but DEQ holds the inspector responsible to be thorough in their inspection. So if they miss something, then DEQ holds them responsible as well for missing something. So it's up to the licensed inspector to do that survey to the best of their abilities, sampling everything suspected. So again, if they cut back a piece of tile and find that there's some vinyl underneath it, that also may need to be tested. So base costs of 10 samples, just be aware it can go up from that. Unfortunately, we've seen some residential situations go up twice that because there's just so many materials with a number of renovations that occurred. And that's something obviously we inform on site before doing anything else. But again, it's up to the inspector. So it's going to definitely change the results of that report if we're not given permission to sample everything. Now, results are usually available in 5 business days. That can definitely be expedited. Additional costs for extra samples. We also do lead testing. It should be noted that there's very few situations where we can't get everything done within your timelines. I know due diligence periods, yeah, 10 days is common. We've seen plenty of 5-day and less to get everything done. So we can accommodate most situations, probably almost all. That's part of the way we operate and do business. And I don't know if you'll find that with every single asbestos company, but I think most asbestos companies are aware of these rules and the need, especially for real estate, to get things done quickly. So abatement, we're not going to go into everything about abatement. I know probably some of the bigger questions are related to cost. Cost is an incredibly difficult thing to estimate because, as we've already talked about, there could be one material over a small area. It might only be a couple $1,000s. There might be more materials, and it might be, like a house that's having a full demolition. There might be quite a few materials that have to be removed. And worse, there might be materials that are removed and then other materials are found underneath it, depending on the company that did the surveying. So it's very difficult to estimate an asbestos abatement project. They can range anywhere from a few thousand to multiple thousand, depending on how many materials, how much area. Best way, if you ever want to know, is just get us out there for a bid. Those are complimentary, and then that way you have a conclusive number instead of a guesstimate or worse. So asbestos projects, they do require a notice form to DEQ before proceeding. In a lot of cases, that's a 10-day notice. And unfortunately, the 10-day notice, and that's a 10 calendar days, DEQ doesn't make exemptions from that, except for actual emergency situations that they say include water, fire, sewer, natural disaster. So unfortunately, real estate transaction deadlines are not considered emergency situations. So that's something to keep in mind when planning that for work being done during real estate transactions. Again, we're not going to go through everything in here. There's a few things that are really important to note, though. Proper licensing. Again, the homeowner is liable if the company out there is not properly licensed or doesn't do the work properly. So having a company that's not only licensed but really knows what they're doing is very important for the homeowners. The site is essentially marked as a hazardous area when the work is being done. We generally recommend that no one be in the home while we're doing our work, even if it's just in a partial area, because if something goes wrong, if you have a dog or a kid that goes to the containment area and breaks through that containment, there really are serious issues beyond just the obvious health factor. with having airborne asbestos particles in that area. There's actually a 3-stage decontamination area that's put up with a clean room, shower area, and dirty room to potentially reduce the outside contamination. Generally, those areas should be vacated. On multiple day projects, occupancy is generally not recommended. The areas being abated are not accessible per DEQ requirements because, very likely at least, whoever is living in the house probably doesn't have licensing to do the abatement work. And it's different when there's a contractor doing the abatement versus the homeowner doing the abatement. So continued occupancy may also require additional containment, tear down, and setup. And all asbestos abatement projects require air clearance sampling by a third party, and that third party cannot be related to the company doing the work or the homeowner. And that's actually a very serious potential fine issue. Due to the nature of material removal, in some cases additional work can be found during the removal process. Again, layers might be scraped back and we might find additional layers underneath. Now, once the material is removed, it's actually double bagged and sealed, and it's labeled with the owner's name, the contractor's name, and the address of the property. So this is where, again, it's really, really important to know the generator is responsible for the asbestos waste for life. That's their life, the homeowner's life. So again, having an abatement company that really knows what they're doing is very prudent. If the company goes out of business and they were found to do fraudulent work, you can guess the DEQ might go back after those previous projects and find out what else they messed up. They do that with other types of work that we are involved with, heating oil tanks, underground storage tanks. So you can bet that they're going to do it in something like asbestos, that they're actively increasing regulation. We've already talked about this a little bit. There's another thing I really want to mention here. The reason this is becoming much of a big concern is what's happening is you have general contractors that are doing work on a project. They're remodeling your kitchen. They probably don't know very much about these rules. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. Now, if they don't know about the rules and they're going to take that construction debris to the landfills are now being fined in a lot of cases for what they have done improperly. Or at the very least, they're being they're looked at with a lot more scrutiny. So because of that, the landfills are going to ask the very first thing, whoever comes in with any amount of building material, what happens, or where did that come from? And when that happens, the contractor better have an answer. And if they don't, then it's a problem. That's a problem for the contractor and a problem for the homeowner. So again, having a contractor that really knows what they're doing with asbestos is going to be much more important. I think that's probably the last real big warning I wanted to get to. I see a question here. I'm going to leave this up for other areas of service that Alpha does, just as a reminder. We're not just involved in asbestos. We've been involved in a lot of different forms of regulation, which is mostly good, I should say, because we have a pretty good idea of how regulations work. And we've had a lot of history with those. So let's get to questions here. And please keep messaging through. I know we're technically over an hour here, but we want to make sure your questions are answered. Is there going to be a required disclosure form for clients to sign, like lead-based paint disclosures? Yes, Alpha already has this, and this is actually being provided for every asbestos and lead inspection project that we deal with. Other companies may or may not do this, but because of how DEQ is already regulating asbestos, and this is going to affect lead shortly, we've kind of jumped ahead of that game and asked that disclosure form be signed prior to anything that we do.
And I think as far as, having it required goes for you all, basically probably what Zach's saying is it may not be required right now, but it is a very good probably practice to build in, even if the form is not required by the agency or whoever else that or DEQ. It's probably very good business practice to put it in now because of the new requirements. And you could probably contact Alpha and have them come out, and if they already have the form, then that's great.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, in a lot of what we do, we've not necessarily aimed to make things more difficult for you all, but we do want to make sure everyone, including ourselves, is protected. So in order to do that, the disclosure forms being signed is a good way to do that, not only for us, but for you. Yeah, another question here. 12 by 12 is a very common tile size. Is there a visual clue that indicates higher or lower risk of the tile containing asbestos? That's a great question. No, there aren't as many visual clues because, again, there's a lot of different colors of asbestos. Most of them are white, but that white might be mixed in with other tile material. So there aren't a lot of clues. If the particular tile was installed in the 1978 and before, that's probably the best clue you have is the age date there. And specifically, tile installed between probably about 1940, 1950 to 1978 is most likely to contain it. We don't see a tile that contains asbestos in every single case. So sorry, no, not in every case is there a good obvious clue there. You can always try to send us a picture and give us the age of the house, and we can work with that as a start, though. Another question, does Alpha have an office in the Salem, Marion / Polk County area? Yes, the office is in Staten. For intents and purposes, I use Salem, and again, Salem branch manager. I use Salem as kind of the central point of operations, even though I'm in Staten. And with that, as part of the Salem operations, I go as far north as Woodburn, as far west as Dallas, as far east as Gates, as far south as Albany, potentially into the Corvallis area without additional trip fees. So pricing that you saw is generally good for those areas and for the rest of our services without a trip fee. But again, you can always call and ask about specific pricing if it's just outside of those areas. Sometimes I'm in the area doing work, so we can kind of combine trips to save some of those costs.
And do you have recommendations if someone's tuning in from Southern Oregon or somewhere, you know, and needs someone to come do one of these tests? Could you give them a recommendation?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's actually a list that DEQ has of all licensed service providers. We haven't personally vetted every single company, but definitely make sure they are on that list. It is unfortunately a relatively short list. It's about 3 pages, about 40 companies. They definitely have to be on that list to avoid any issues. So yeah, for people outside of the Salem and Portland areas, that'd be the first place I would look. And then you can actually ask for a list of their services and commendations. That's something legally you can ask them for as part of their licensing with DEQ, and that's something that DEQ instituted. So you can ask them for their experience level and kind of a list of background on them. So unfortunately, no, I don't have specific companies I can recommend other than on that list. That's a great place to start, though.
Great. Well, I don't see any other questions coming in, so thank you, Zach, for coming out, and I apologize for the technical difficulties we had. It's you know, nothing like using the internet to broadcast visual and voice. So thank you all. If you have any questions, just feel free to email me and I can get you connected with Zach. And if you want to use him, his phone number is here, and I can get everyone his email if you email me. Thanks, everyone.